So dear friends, if you pay attention, at least for the last 5 weeks, we focused on the Bread of Life discourse from the Gospel of John. This Sunday, eventually, we return back to the Gospel of Mark after we skip it at least for the 5 Sundays. And then I just let you know our reflection today, the Gospel of Mark, it will last until the end of the liturgical year, especially with the celebration Christ, the King of the universe. And that celebration is precisely on the last Sunday of November. So we have a long way to go to focus on the Gospel of Mark. But today, the starting point of our reflections begins with the arrival of the Pharisees from Jerusalem. So as you pay attention, it sounds very normal, nothing special. They're just a group of people who came from Jerusalem. And as they arrive, they gather around Jesus. As you pay attention to the gospel today, the gospel says, the Pharisees with some scribes who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus. So nothing special. In the Gospel of Mark, the name of places where the event took place are very important. So whether we like it or not, if we want to pay attention to the Gospel of Mark, we have to pay attention also to the name of the places. So it is very important when it has something to do with Jesus' ministry. And the question now is, why is it so important? Because the Gospel of Mark tries to make sense of the event in the past as well as their relationship to Jesus when the events occurs. So the reason why it is very important, because the Gospel of Mark would like to emphasize the place and also in the connection of Jesus. And this is the reason why for the next biblical accounts in the Gospel of Mark in all Sundays until the end of the liturgical year, we will hear the name of different places, such as District of Tyre, Sidon, District of Decapolis, Galilee, and Jericho, Capernaum, Caesarea Philippi, and so on. So these are the places where Jesus moved around with his disciples in order to do his ministries. But now, at this point, in our reflection today, we hear the name of Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem. Why Jerusalem? Maybe we do not know. Well, we know the Jerusalem city is, but there is a message here that we need to pay attention to. So in the Gospel of Mark, Jerusalem has a significant role in the ministry of Jesus. And the Gospel of Mark also tells us that Jerusalem is a place or city where Jesus will die. So before we go to the message of today's Gospel, the Gospel of Mark tells us that there is a place very important that we need to pay attention. That is Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is a place where Jesus will die. And by saying that these Pharisees and the scribes are coming from Jerusalem, the Gospel of Mark is linking not only these groups of people, the scribes and the Pharisees, who are responsible to the crucifixion of Jesus, and also to the death and the resurrections. So in other words, in the Gospel of Mark, there is a vision that the mystery of salvation will happen in Jerusalem, Jerusalem city. Because Jerusalem is a city that has become the center of Jewish religiosity. So that's why the Gospel of Mark today mentions there was a Jews, the scribes and the Pharisees came from Jerusalem. So the Gospel of Mark reminds us that Jerusalem is a place where Jesus will die. And these two people who are responsible for the death of Jesus. Now, we know that Jerusalem already has a significant role here. But now, as we try to understand the context of today's gospel, let us find out who are these people, the Pharisees and the scribes. And there are other groups also, like the Sadducees and Sanhedrin and many other groups. We have to understand that they are different group of people, and they have a significant role also with Jesus. So let us go with the gospel, with the role of the scribe. In the time of Jesus, the Pharisees was a group of spiritual leaders that consists of laymen and clergymen, meaning to say this group are a priest, but also a clergy people. So these people strongly emphasize the practice of the law of Moses. What is the law of Moses? That's the book of Torah. And what's in the book of Torah? That's the 5 books in the Old Testament. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and also the book of Deuteronomy. So that's the first reading that we have today. That was taken from a book of Torah. That's when these people emphasize the practice of the book of Torah, meaning to say they understand perfectly about the book of Torah. So as a group of spiritual leaders, the Pharisees accept the written law of Moses, but they are more open to the interpretations of the law, which in many cases becomes the cultural traditions. When I'm saying through cultural traditions, that's exactly what here in the gospel today. Because they believe that the law that God gave to Moses was twofold, which means consisting of the written law and also oral law. So therefore, the primary focus of the Pharisees was to harmonize the teaching of Torah with their own interpretations and then put it into the practice. So at this point, they are called the traditionalists, but also conservative group. So this is what we call the Pharisees. And these Pharisees emphasize the book of Torah, but also the practice, because they try to conserve what they believe, and then they need to practice it also. So that's why in the gospel today, since they are the traditionalists and also conservative people, we can hear what they say. For the Pharisees, and in fact, all the Jews, they do not eat without carefully washing their hands, keeping the tradition of the elders, and on coming from the marketplace, they do not eat without purifying themselves. And there are many other things that they have traditionally observed: purification of cups, jugs, kettles, and beds. So this is a cultural things that we need to say instead of the book of Torah, because it is not written in the book of Torah, but rather they interpret it and then put into practice, and they do it. Now, we know this group, Pharisees. Another question right now is, who are the scribes? Because these two groups very significant into this gospel. So the scribes were the scholars and also the practitioners of the Old Testament, whose main duty was to study the law of Moses, the book of Torah. They tried to transcribe it and write commentaries on it. So as a scholar of the law, a scribe had a legal status in the ancient society of Israel because they have authority to write a civil law. For instance, I give you example, the bill of divorce. So in a couple of weeks, you will hear the Pharisees brought a woman who caught adultery and asked Jesus. And Jesus asked, so, Master, this lady caught adultery. And then Jesus asked, what is the law of the Moses? Well, according to the law, this woman is responsible to be stoned to death. But Jesus here is different. That's why the law is written by the scribes. So now, from this information, at least we can understand in the Gospel of Mark, when there are Pharisees, there are also scribes. It is because some scribes could be Pharisees, but not every Pharisee could be a scribe. The bottom line is that as a spiritual leaders of the Israel, Pharisees and the scribes, they get along very well. So, but do not get me wrong, although Jesus in his encounter with the Pharisees and the scribes, always against them, but it doesn't mean that there were no good Pharisees or scribes. So I give you example in the gospel, not here, but in the book of the gospel, we have several instances like a Pharisees who are good. For instance, Nicodemus. Nicodemus, a couple days before Jesus was crucified, he came to meet Jesus, asking the salvation, who can be saved right now? So, that Nicodemus. And then we have a Gamaliel, the teacher of St. Paul. And even St. Paul himself, Those people are the scribes and also the Pharisees. So they are good people, by the way. Now, we know who Pharisees and the scribes are, since they emphasize the teaching of the law and conserve the practice of Torah. Then we can easily find their concern into this gospel. The first question that I asked to Jesus is, why do your disciples not follow the tradition of the elders, but instead eat a meal with unclean hands? So there is nothing wrong with these questions, but they use these questions questioning Jesus. So this question is very tricky, by the way. We need to pay attention, and to understand these questions, we have to be careful here, because their concern actually is not to the disciple who ate with unclean hands, but rather to Jesus himself, who is the leader of the disciple. Meaning to say, as a leader, Jesus should know better, and he should have taught his disciple to keep the tradition of the elders, especially eating with eating a meal with unclean hands. So by asking that questions, the Pharisees and the scribes are really accusing Jesus of not following the law of Moses and acting as if he believes to be above the law. So that's why the question into this gospel from the scribes and the Pharisees is very problematic. They were not questioning the disciple of the Lord, but rather they're questioning Jesus himself. As a master, as a teacher, you need to know better. Why you let your disciple eating the meal without washing their hands? So that means Jesus is responsible for that actions. So that's why, knowing that he is being accused, Jesus responds them by quoting some verses from the book of Isaiah. Please pay attention, this conversation has changed when Jesus quoting the book of Isaiah. These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as a doctrine human percepts. So by quoting these verses of the book of Isaiah, Jesus also calls them hypocrites. Now, there are many definitions hypocrites. What the hypocrites are, we have a different, sometimes there are different definitions. But in the context of our reflection today, the word hypocrite means people who pretends to be virtuous, but in reality, they do not act in accordance with their beliefs. And that's precisely the hypocrites. That means the scribes and also the Jews. Now, back to the gospel today. Why did Jesus call the Pharisees and the scribes hypocrites? It is because they abandon the commandments of God and hold to the human traditions. Meaning to say, okay, you understand 100% about Torah, about the law of Moses. You interpreted it and put into practice in the daily life, but you yourself, you do not do it. So that's the big question there from Jesus. So therefore, in the eyes of Jesus, the Pharisees and the scribes are people who not only do not practice what they preach, but they also do the opposite of what they preach. And by calling the hypocrites, Jesus really condemned the scribes and the Pharisees for the distortions of traditions in order to circumvent the law. So Jesus is not rejecting the law. In fact, he is rebuking the Pharisees and the scribes for their failure to uphold it. Jesus is pretty smart here in order to answer them. So the point is very clear here. If the Pharisees and the scribes emphasize the tradition and doctrine of human precepts, for Jesus himself, the issue is not the ritual purity or even of what the tradition ought to follow. The issue is on the heart, in the state of the human heart. In order to justify this teaching, then Jesus brought the matter of the heart with his quotation from the book of Isaiah. So now, in order to make it clear again, Jesus put together all people and explained it. that the things that come out of the heart come evil thoughts, unchastity, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, blasphemy, arrogance, and folly. So all these evil thoughts come from within and they defile. So therefore, whatever they practice, whichever tradition they do or do not uphold, these are not the things that by themselves get them ready for God's kingdom. So the conversation has become a tension here, and it is very clear, the bottom line of Jesus, that this is not the things very important, but in your disposition of your heart must be considered very important here. Otherwise, you just neglect everything in your heart and just following what you interpreted, but you do not really practice it. So, dear friends, after we understand the context of the gospel today, the conversation between Jesus, Pharisees, and the scribes, now for our reflections. We have heard how Jesus addressed the hypocrisy of the scribes and the Pharisees by pointing out that the human traditions do not play a significant role in order to encounter God, but rather the disposition of the human hearts does. And now, for our reflection again, why our heart is very important. Because the heart is a person's hidden center, the place of truth, decisions, and covenant. Our heart is symbol of sacredness to express a sense of truth, love, and pure existence. It is a place when we encounter our God. And at the same time, it is the very core of our human being, the spiritual center of our humanity. So therefore, if our heart is being polluted, contaminated with the sense of greedy, unchastity, theft, murder, adultery, or other things, then it will no longer a place or a center of our conscience. Because from the heart, our actions come true. In other words, our attitude or our actions are manifestation of the heart, and our actions eventually determine the quality of who we are. This is precisely what Jesus meant into this gospel by saying, from within people, from their hearts come evil thoughts, and all this evil come from within and they defile. So now, just for our reflections, I would like to leave this homily with a questions. Let's take a moment of silence and ask ourselves, how is the disposition of our heart, at least today? Do we exhibit the Christian values as Jesus Christ taught us, or do we rather exhibit personal ambitions for the achievement?